I've been privileged to be involved in student ministry for over 10 years now, and I think there has been a definite shift in culture, particularly in the Western European universities in which I've worked the most. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, the rise of new atheism, both in America and here in Europe, led to probably quite a hostile reaction on many student campuses towards the gospel. I remember going in to speak at events where you would have a whole host of hostile questioners throwing difficult questions at you. And that was because people had imbibed some of the hostile reactions of people like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and the other new atheists. It's interesting that in the last couple of years, even the new atheists themselves have begun to admit that new atheism as a movement has really come into decline. It hasn't had the impact that people thought it would. Surveys show that on campus, people are more likely to identify as an agnostic than an atheist than they were 10 years ago. And that's partly because 10 years ago or 15 years ago, many students still had some kind of Christian background. But increasingly, as Europe becomes more secularized, many students are coming to university with no knowledge whatsoever of the Christian faith and no experience of church. Now, in some ways, that's a challenge. We have to remember that there's no biblical framework. We've got to start from scratch. But in other ways, that's an opportunity because it means that people aren't coming with preconceived ideas that need to be knocked down. They aren't coming with objections. They just don't know at all. And so into that, we can really have an opportunity to share the gospel. And so that means that we've had to adapt our approach somewhat in terms of how we try and connect with where students are at. 10 years ago, the main way of attracting people to a student event was often to ask some of the hostile questions that the new atheists were asking. How can God allow suffering? Isn't religion dangerous? How can Christianity claim to be the only way? And so on. Today, most students aren't even aware that those are objections that they should have. I was speaking at an event in Croatia recently, and we were doing a survey and asking students the question, does the presence of suffering disprove the existence of God? And almost 95% of people said, no, it doesn't, to which we were somewhat surprised. A follow-up question revealed that the reason why people said no was not because they were Christians and they had worked out the problem of suffering in their mind, but they weren't even aware that suffering presented a problem to a theistic worldview. They had such a limited understanding of who God is that they hadn't even begun to think how that might impact their view on something like suffering and pain in the world. So we need to start further back, and we need to start with the more general concerns and desires that people have. So instead of maybe looking at the question of why does God allow suffering, maybe we need to ask questions like, where is the purpose in my pain? Or instead of asking, how can Jesus be the only way to God, we might need to ask the question, how can we have harmony in a world of competing truth claims? So we take people's desires and concerns that they have, of which they have many, and then look at how the Christian faith can answer that in the most satisfying way and to show the truth claims behind it too. So it has changed, but I would say that's an opportunity. And certainly in the UK, where I do most missions, but in other parts of Europe too, we're seeing more fruitfulness and more response to the gospel now than we have in any time over the last 10 to 15 years. So I think we've got reasons to be encouraged, and I think we need to make the most of that opportunity.